What is divine motivation theory? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Today I have once again with me my friend Chester Delegneau. Delegneau.
That's it. Say it again. Delegneau. Yep.
Delegneau.
Got it.
Chester. Le Chester.
Le Chester. Oh.
So today we're talking about divine motivation theory. Last time we talked about divine, a specific version of divine command theory.
Right.
And you engage with divine motivation theory in your book, Biblical Ethics. So if you're interested, I'll put a link in the description. The divine motivation theory developed by Linda Zagzebski.
From my understanding.
Yeah. And what is divine motivation theory?
So it replaces the need for divine command theory. So divine command theory seems. I think her argument was to say that Bill Alston's version of it seems ad hoc. She had some issues with it not being so. In other words, motivation is a reason, is what she would say, right? They're justifying reasons. And so if you have motivation, you don't need divine command theory to set the thermostat for morality. Mm-hmm. You know, you just have God doing, and we just do what he does because he is motivated by love to motivate us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So if we were to answer the question, to be good, X is good means what?
X is good is to imitate the acts of God.
Okay.
Which is good because I like that a lot. I think that helps to explain. I think that goes away from that Platonic. I think it's a weakness that divine command theory can fall into, is by saying, oh, because it's the principle, we ground morality on the principle of God's goodness. Mm-hmm. And it kind of has this Platonic, this general idea of, what's good is just, these principles, of goodness that God does or whatever, or that who he is. But the problem with that is, well, what we can just say that's good and it's really not good. It's just kind of this, it's vacuous, or it's, the content doesn't really seem to be well grounded. There was a comment on the last podcast.
Allison, she's good.
She brought up a great question, and that was the question. It was like, well, we can just call it good, and how do we know it's really good? And I think one way around that is to point to, right, the God that motivates us, right? That de re, mm-hmm. Necessity. That it's that God right there, huh? You see him? Yep, Jesus, when he came to earth and he lived, and we follow him and what he does. So I think that really does move the argument forward, is to talk about that de re necessity, mm-hmm. Looking at God himself and his acts, in Old Testament, New Testament. I like that a lot. So I like divine motivation theory a lot. So what I think we should do is marry the two. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah. That I guess it begs the question.
Yeah. What's wrong with divine motivation theory?
Why do we or why it seems, why two? Why not one? Why it seems superfluous, to do. We don't need two if one can do it. But I think there's a problem with DMT.
Okay, and so what would be that problem?
Well, if I'm understanding her correctly, she is saying that that motivation, that God's love that God is not just love, that he is motivated to love.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I've been just racking my brain trying to understand what she's saying. I've reached out to her. I never got a response. To, better understand, like, what does she mean by, it's part of his nature. His motive to love is part of his nature. His motive to love is part of his nature. And I'm like, well, if his motive to love is part of his nature, first of all, what does that mean, part of his nature, But if it is, then it sounds like in God as a necessary being and his nature is to exist and necessarily exist, then he has to motivate us. And I'm just thinking, wait a second, but then that would mean that he has to create us in order to motivate us. And that just sounds weird, right? Like, oh, we're saying then that God has to create. He needs us in some way.
Could Zagzebski get away with placing that motivation in the Trinity and saying, look, if the Father motivates the Son motivates the Holy Spirit, they don't need us in order to be motivating. They're just motivating each other. And then they decide to over-motivate, like from the superabundance of motivation.
Right.
Do you think she could get away with that?
Let's see, God's nature is, God's motive to love is part of his nature. Yeah, I guess you could. I guess you can, it wouldn't, I mean, then it would just mean that she has God loving, there's this, beautiful picture of God and, the Godhead loving and serving one another, or, having a reason, to love one another. And I like that. So I would say, yeah, but then don't you still have the problem then of, you are motivating, that it's part of his nature to motivate, and so he has to create, because the whole purpose of having this discussion isn't just talking about theology. It's how theology, it coincides with anthropology. It's this, okay, we've talked about God, and now from God, man grounds, morality based on, and we talked about divine command theory, based on his commands, and we saw a problem with that. So he says, no, we can't just have it commands, it's based on his nature, it's based on his will, but, things like that. And so don't we have that same problem though, saying that, that he has to motivate his creation, in order to love. It's part of his necessary being, so he has to do it. Yes, I would say he does it in the Trinity, but for us to know that that morality, what morality is to know that it's from his loving nature, in the Trinity, let's say. So we just look to the Trinity to see what the Trinity does, and then we replicate that, or we do that. But isn't it part of his necessary being to motivate? So, I mean, I guess she would then just say yes to motivate only God himself, but not his creation. But then that seems ad hoc to me.
Okay.
Because if it's part of his nature, it's necessarily part of his nature, then he's going to do it. I don't see God just putting a limitation on himself to do that if it's necessary, if it's an essential property.
Yeah, and so this is going to introduce some kind of necessity that we would rather not have.
Right. I think
we must avoid, right?
Yeah, because then it seems to present a problem that God is obligated to create us in order to express his love in the form of motive, and motivating his motive to love.
Yeah, because I guess one thing you could point it to is the fact that in the Trinity, the type of love is going to be different because, like there doesn't need to be any kind of motivation to change, insofar as the three persons are complete.
Right.
So there are no actions that are needed.
Right.
Whereas when we're talking about morality, if we're talking about motivation to action, then that's going to be something that is going to draw us to do something that either fills a need that we have, or is some kind of rule that we're supposed to follow. Or something like that.
Exactly, because she talks about that imitating him. Well, okay, imitating him how? If he doesn't create, we can't know that. So he has to create for us to be to create, and for him to do for us to see what he has done and then do likewise. Otherwise, it just seems this sort of ethereal concept of we can ground it in the Trinity, okay, but he's not. How is that a model for us?
Yeah, and a lot of people will want ethics to be, I don't know if we would say necessary, but in a way, like that the rules, like that it would always be wrong to murder, or to rape, or something like that. And this would sound like, unless God made us, unless he had these kinds of motivations, I don't know. Maybe it's a per impossible kind of conditional. Like, if God had not made us,
right,
then there would be no motivation to act a particular way. But
if it's part of his nature, and his nature is necessary, then doesn't he have to act? It's necessary. That's why. Okay, so my thought is this: why can't we? I love the motivation, and I think that helps to make it more robust. This understanding of, why we're obligated, to do good, and so it adds to the conversation something that is needed, and so I like the idea of still grounding it in the nature of God. So it's not divine command. His commands don't ground morality. It's his nature. It's his nature, and then again, his nature. His nature, and from his nature, he has motivations, right? So his motivation is not part. So if you look at it this way, we use like accidental and essential properties, right?
Yeah.
So accidentally, he doesn't have to motivate his creation in every possible world, right? There are worlds where he doesn't create any. There is no world. He doesn't have to create, but in this world, let's say, in the actual world, he created us so that he can motivate us. So what that would, and how that works is, he didn't have to create us to motivate us, because necessarily in his nature, he is love, but he doesn't have, and he's love within the Trinity. He doesn't have to motivate us. He is already love. But he created us so that he can love us infra creation, not super creation. So in other words, supra being before, infra after.
Oh, okay.
So I would look at it like a God who has a nature of love and has the accidental property, or the property. It sounds strange probably for people when they hear accidental, like the God accidental. What are you talking about? It's a contingent property.
A non-essential.
A non-essential. He doesn't have to practice it if he doesn't want to. And so, what that idea is, that motivation property is an accidental or a contingent, a non-essential, and so he doesn't have to do it if he doesn't want to. And then from that, I would say, stems his will, and then from his will, his commands. in that kind of way. I'm not saying, trust me, I'm not up here trying to tell you that this is exactly how it works, but one way that just kind of makes sense to me,
Right.
and I look at it when I look at the model of the orbital shell, orbital electron orbital shells of an atom. The nucleus is love. Then you go to the orbital shell,
Yeah.
and then you have motivation, and all of these other ones are, so the nucleus is core. It has to be, and then you have these orbital shells. Motivation. The next one is will, and the furthest one is command. And so he creates us and motivates us to love like he loves after he creates, so that he is obligated to show us love and to motivate us once he does create us, but he didn't have to create us.
Yeah.
So super creation, before creation, he could have done it. He could have created us, to motivate us, to show us love, or he didn't have to. But once he does create, I do believe that he is under obligation to show us love.
Do you think that obligation is something that is necessary by his nature, or is it something that he wills?
So after he creates us, he is obligated to show us love. Yeah, I don't think he has the choice or can will not yes and no, yeah or no. I actually decided not, against motivating them. I think because he is a God of love, once he does create us, I think he needs to properly represent himself.
Okay.
And
because that's a loving thing.
It's a loving thing to do, and for our sake, right? Yeah. Because my book, in this book, Biblical Ethics, I talk about this concept within the framework of eudaimonism, which is the idea that God is a flourishing God, and He creates us in order to flourish. So it's this idea that
it's in order for us to flourish, right? Not for him to flourish.
Right. Yeah. He flourishes, and so from his flourishing being, he creates us to flourish. It's really this idea of living the good life,
right?
And that happiness is the greatest good for living the good life. But happiness properly understood, not the subjective happiness, but a happiness that is grounded in morality, in virtues, which has been the dominant way of looking at morality throughout church history. It's only until recently now, the last few hundred years, that people can attach happiness to whatever they want to.
Through philosophical history too. I mean, that's like we're talking
that's right.
The early days, right?
Yeah.
So.
And this goes back to the classics, goes back to Plato and Aristotle. I mean, even from there, they all talked about happiness. They talked about the greatest good, happiness being the greatest good, to living, the good life. But they all also obviously differed on what virtues, were the most important, most seminal.
Right. Do you think then that DMT, is it DMT? Mm-hmm. That sounds like an illicit substance. So
I know, right? DCT, DMT, modified MDM. I don't know. I get lost.
Do you think then marrying this with the DCT comes with any kind of are there any infelicitous?
Not that I can think of. I mean, you have the motivation, you throw the motivation into the pot, the stirring pot of the modified divine command theory that I was telling you about, that you talk about the nature of God, and God is motivated by his loving nature, and I think from that he wills, and from that he actually commands, or I don't know. I just think we need both, and I don't really necessarily see a downside.
Do you have a model for this order that you have? Like, is it ontological? Is it is it a just a hierarchical, or
I'm not sure.
not biological?
No. Yeah, I'd have to think about it some more. So repeat your question.
So
maybe in a different way, so I can
like,
think about it.
is it the case that that his nature and his will are not separate things, so that when we say that it goes in this order, we are just listing it out in our own understanding, or is there an actual ontological?
No, I don't want to do that. That sounds a little too. Yeah, I'm getting into the mind of God, and I'm telling you exactly how things are. Yeah, I think this is just the way we understand it, but I think that there's something to that. Well, the model I was using, that orbital shell model. I think there's something to that. I don't think that's exactly how it works, but talking about space, let's say, because if you're talking about the father there, he's a spiritual being. Well, how does that work? Because we have these orbital shells that are in space, and he doesn't seem to occupy space the same way that an electron or a proton or material things do. So it's not an exact science analogy, but I think it does get to it. I guess that's what analogies do, right? It gets to it, but then you really try to understand it, and then it just begins to break down.
Yeah.
Right?
That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, we do that with analogies of the Trinity all the time, right?
Right.
And you're just like, oh, that falls into heresy, and that one isn't. That's heretical too, So I don't want to be heretical and be like, this is the way it is, and this is exactly how, this defines, or this, and I think. Yeah, I don't know. I just started thinking about thinking about the Eucharist, and how we have these different analogies or models. The transubstantiation and transelementation, consubstantiation, and how they try to get to better understand. And I think it's important, but I don't know. Is his presence in that cracker? Or in that or is it around it, or is it? How does that work? I don't really know, but I think it's getting close to it, and I like that. I like that. I don't know. I like that it's mysterious. To be honest with you, because it's God, and I'm.
Yeah, I always like to say that. I mean, we barely understand. If you look at philosophy of mind, check the playlist. Philosophy of mind, we don't understand how we work.
Yeah.
Let
alone, right?
God who created us, thinking that we know what that's going to be like.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
But it's fun.
Yeah.
But it is fun.
It's great.
To talk and
I think
to think, and
it's not totally vacuous. I think there's many things that we could learn. We could definitely learn. I'm a big fan of the via negativa,
What's that?
The starting off with the way God is not, looking at here's the way we are. God is like this, but not quite, like he's being like our being, but not limited like our being, something like that.
Seems a very respectful way to start. I like that philosophy, or that, to start that way.
Kid gloves, yeah. Are there any more arguments that you have for DMT by itself? What is Zagzebski? Do you know?
Well, I have questions.
Is it just like DC? Is her argument just DCT sucks? So, this fixes the ad hocness.
I don't think she I don't want to say anything that's not true.
Linda watches this.
Yeah, right.
So
she's gonna watch this, and she's gonna.
She's gonna call him. Yeah, she's gonna be on
because she has my cell phone.
Yeah.
Let me. What does she say? Now I say here, Zagzebski makes some excellent observations concerning both DCT and DMT. It appears plausible that the divine motives justify a loving God to inspire us to action for our own flourishing. I also agree that divine motives are more basic than the divine will, even in DC theory.
Okay.
So I'm seeing that's true, and it's more basic. However, I'm a bit uncomfortable with Zagzebski's vague description of the relationship between God's nature and his motives.
Yeah.
And so I have some questions when she talks about it's part of his nature. Wait, what do you mean by part? Are you just is that just a façon de parler? Are you just using a figure of speech here? Because I'm taking it literal. And if it is, then I see a problem with it. And sometimes it's hard to understand because how is a person using terms and phrases? So I don't mean to do her any injustice, but I have questions about about it, but I like it. I think it helps explain things better. It gives it explanatory power. Yeah.
So let's do this. We've got divine motivation theory.
Okay.
Why don't I have you back for having specifically Christian Unitarianism?
Ooh, yeah.
And I'll do a different video on virtue ethics.
Yeah, but I'll bring in virtue ethics into that a little bit. Yeah, and talk about that, how it's a little different though.
And then, I think that would be good.
Thanks, Cheeks.
All right.
Appreciate it.
That's all we got for today, and I'll see you on the next video. Adios.